Faith, hope, and family were the expectations of Daystar viewers. The Christian world would not be rocked by this scandal. But new, disturbing information regarding Joanie Lamb, the lost millions, and the network's hidden secrets is just now coming to light. What transpired in reality after all those cameras? Nobody knew the reality. When did all that was constructed in God's name begin to fall apart? You will be astounded by the answers. It began on a low key. There were only 3 of them in the cramped boardroom at Daystar. No photographers, no spectators. The atmosphere was calm and courteous, right up until Joanie Lamb posed the question that would alter the course of events. The words weighed heavily on his mother's mind as he said, "Mom, did you really use $100,000 of Daystar money for your honeymoon?" No response from Joni straight away. The expression on her face betrayed her attempt to hide her surprise. She appeared composed and even a touch icy. Sitting next to her was Tom Calendarer, a valued board member and personal friend of hers. His chair swiveled and he emitted a little laugh, the type that attempts to mend fences. He nonchalantly mentioned that they would simply give it to her as a present. It wasn't insignificant to Jonathan, though. Throughout his childhood, he witnessed his parents work tirelessly to establish Daystar, a ministry that had developed into a beacon of hope for many people. In the belief that it was for God's work, people had given their last dollars. They gave because they cared, because they believed. The realization that the funds were being handled as if they were personal belongings finally dawned on him as he sat in that room. He kept his voice down. Something changed inside him, but he refrained from making accusations. The subsequent quiet was more oppressive than any debate ever could have been. Not one journey, not one payment. That was at the heart of this. It all came down to the implications of that choice. So, it was clear that nobody was standing by, nobody was inquiring, and perhaps nobody gave a damn. Jonathan had a restless night that night. In his mind, the meeting kept playing back and forth. The casual dismissal of $100,000 in donor funds, Tom's remarks, and his mother's subdued response. Then he prayed. Took part in a wrestling match. Is this an exaggeration? He thought to himself. In his heart, though, he knew otherwise. Neither family loyalty nor preserving one's reputation were at play. It centered on acting morally. Therefore, he chose to address the crowd. Though he had no intention of bringing disgrace upon his mother or dismantling the ministry, he felt compelled to speak his mind. The flame that ignited everything concealed under Daystar's flawless persona was that one straightforward, courageous question. Upon initially inquiring about the funds, Jonathan held the belief that it might have been a mere oversight and not paying attention, something that could be corrected. But when he dug further, he realized it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a system, a secret edifice constructed over many years, intended to appear completely external while concealing all internal workings. Daystar has always portrayed itself as a shining example of Christian unity, connecting millions of people around the world through worship, hope, and the gospel. It appeared to be ideal at first glance. Superb broadcasts, stirring preaching, and sincere prayer lines. However, behind the brilliant illuminations and joyful expressions, there was an additional element. Jonathan came to the realization that the Daystar was not your average ministry the more he dug. Unlike other organizations, it did not have accessible financial records, periodic reports, or independent audits. Actually, it wasn't required to. The truth was revealed to Jonathan at that moment. Because of that, his perspective shifted. Daystar was not listed as a media nonprofit, a church it was officially declared to be. Everything shifted with that single word. Since Daystar is a religious organization, it is exempt from the requirement to submit yearly tax returns. The source, amount, and destination of the funds were not required to be shown. The numbers were only visible to a small group of people. And there were just 3 people within that circle. People, the Lamb family, Joni, Jonathan, and Tom Calendarer, who is both Jonathan's personal friend and a board member. There were 3 individuals in charge of a global donation operation that received contributions of several $millions. Independent auditors and a sizable board of directors were non-existent, overseeing the financial sector. Joni made decisions alone most of the time, and everyone else merely went along with it. Jonathan didn't give the building much of his attention at first. His parents have a long history of being respected authorities. Honesty was a theme they had lectured on, regarding being open and honest in the eyes of God and humanity. However, following that meeting, their statements began to sound empty. His mind started to wander to the number of times comparable judgments had been made in private. Money was transferred, gifts were given, and trips were funded, all without the people's knowledge. Observing Daystar's methods, he turned around. Contributors contacted daily, offering anything they could. Some people included handwritten notes with their little checks. Hopefully this is sufficient, but it is all I possess. The aged, they thought their contributions were aiding in the propagation of the gospel, whether they were widows, single moms, or young families. Nobody outside of Joni and the ministry's inner circle knew how their money was being spent. Despite their unwavering trust in them, there was no weak link in the power system. The whole operation was centered around Joni. Expenditure was given her nod. The checks were signed by her. Hers were the last judgments. She came out as kind, spiritual, and loving on camera. When not filmed, she played the heads of a vast empire that is completely unchecked. She had the option to designate a certain amount as a ministry expense. Nobody could stop her from labeling an indulgence as a gift if she so desired. Nobody could question her authority because no regulations were in existence. Jonathan became aware of patterns. Luxurious studio renovations, pricey productions, private jet travel, and high-end apparel. While technically nothing was incorrect, I couldn't get the feeling that it was unethical, in particular when the donors themselves were struggling to make ends meet. He came to the realization that it had nothing to do with greed. It dealt with a system that enabled greed. Daystar's position as a church member wasn't an exception by chance. That was on purpose. It gave Joni the freedom to manage a worldwide network in near-complete anonymity. No inquiries were asked by the IRS, and the legislation did not necessitate responses. Daystar was not required to provide annual reports detailing their financial transactions, unlike other organizations. It was safeguarded by the same regulations as modest, neighborhood churches that distributed food on Sundays, not by multinational media conglomerates that aired their programming all over the globe. The thought kept resurfacing in Jonathan's mind. The emotionally charged pleas for money, the flashing screens, and the thoughtfully crafted fundraising ads always gave him the willies. People were donating with the sincere belief that their money would be used for ministry, outreach, and missions. However, what was the actual amount? Nobody outside of that little chamber would ever suspect a thing. He started to notice that the building itself had been designed to conceal things. Every dime, not just the honeymoon fund. The more covert the arrangement was, the more the boundaries divide between Joni's personal life and her ministry, between Joni's faith and her business. Everyone had accepted it for years without question since it appeared to be blessed. Each show was a smashing success. People gave a lot of money. Everyone thought the Lambs were immune. Joni was a revered spiritual figure to the audience. Inside, she was seen as the head honcho. Also, you disregarded the boss's authority. That's why the sum of $100,000 seemed so substantial. It wasn't merely the sum. It demonstrated the efficacy of the system to perfection, in secrecy, and without responsibility. No one outside of the closed-door meeting would have ever guessed that they used funds that did not rightfully belong to them. The activities of a single individual weren't the only cause of the situation, Jonathan understood. It constituted the whole base. This kind of event might happen because of how Daystar was created. Additionally, he was finally unable to perceive it as a ministry. The empire was secretive while preaching enlightenment. Considering that began to emerge, Jonathan realized that speaking out would reveal more than simply one incident. It would reveal the system as a whole, the framework that allowed millions to flow unfettered, power to remain unregulated, and for one family to determine the true purpose of God's money. After he realized what it was, hit and nobody noticed. It started off as nothing more than a whisper, a rumor that made its way through whispered discussions and private communications. Joanie Lamb and money, that's about it. Few were willing to accept it as true. In the end, Joni wasn't your average TV host. For millions, she represented a guiding spirit. She had a reputation for praying with guests, offering comfort to strangers, and speaking things that moved people. But rumors can travel quickly. What began as an innocent inquiry quickly became a tempest that Daystar could not escape. The story started when someone who couldn't keep quiet any longer spilt bits of Jonathan's story, not out of vengeance or hatred. Rumors circulated in the boardroom that Joni had secretly spent $100,000 from the ministry on her honeymoon with Doug Weiss, according to a reliable source. With the gift tag. Everything changed the moment that information got out into the world. Blogs and Christian message boards were a hive of activity in no time. Does this actually sound plausible? Is Joni guilty of misusing donor money? Does Daystar's downfall begin now? People who had never doubted the ministry before began to wonder as the conversations progressed. Daystar employees were unavailable when inquiries erupted on social media. Everyone could barely hear a sound. In the beginning, Daystar's group attempted to disregard it. Exactly 0 posts, 0 statements, 0. Acting as if nothing was happening, their inaction exacerbated the situation. In the face of betrayal, people persist in seeking answers. They up the volume. People who had donated for a long time started posting their experiences online. I put my faith in Joni's letter and sent her my last $50. Now I feel like a fool. And another woman said, "If this is true, I don't just feel cheated, I feel heartbroken." The news traveled at the speed of light. Channels on YouTube began reporting on it. It gained traction on Christian podcasts. After that, word got out to the whole public. Unexpected headlines surfaced, leaving Daystar puzzled. Suspected of squandering donor funds, Daystar founder faces charges. The article's wording was irrelevant. The harm had already been done. Now that everyone was looking, they could see the fissures that had been there the whole time. Sir Jonathan did not contact news outlets. He was afraid he would do harm to his loved ones. However, his unassuming truth became the focal point of the controversy once reporters started investigating. Everyone was waiting for him to speak. No one else dared to pose the inquiry that the Sun had dared to ask would. However, Jonathan remained largely quiet. He let the evidence to do the talking. In contrast, Joni had no choice but to answer. Her comments were ineffective when she did speak up at last. The assertion was made by her, the funds had already been returned and that the entire incident had been caused by a misunderstanding. That answer, however, seemed weak to a lot of people. If it was really a misunderstanding, then why was it reimbursed only after questions began to be asked? Why was no one aware of it earlier? The reasoning and the timeline were completely off. People were more than just furious. They had injuries. They had put their hope, money, and prayers in Joni for a long time. Her every word on camera had been believed by them. And the next step is, they were beginning to see that the ideal of honesty and virtue in which they had placed their faith may not have existed. This was a deeply personal tragedy. Daystar started to show signs of internal weakness as the reaction intensified. A few employees slipped out under the radar. Some stayed, but they didn't deny that the stress was too much. Closed doors and tense murmurs characterized the behind-the-scenes meetings. Getting on camera had become a complete mystery. A studio based on secrets now occupied the space that had previously been a house of prayer and inspiration. People who used to watch the show no longer do. Contributions decreased. Some pastors who had worked with Daystar before started to distance themselves from him as a result of the incident. Prayer requests that had been coming in non-stop had all but dried up, and the few people who were still picking up the calls seemed to have vanished into thin air, felt stumped every time a caller repeated the same inquiry. Could it be? At the same time, social media never let up. Commenters demanded explanations for every single photo, video clip, and appearance that Joni shared online. Did the funds disappear? Go? Why are you so reluctant to discuss it? To be honest is what you preach. Is yours somewhere? The questions persisted despite the ministry's best efforts to move on. Then the videos started rolling in, heartsick submissions from longtime viewers of Daystar, including a number of elderly women. They were neither furious nor yelling. Their hearts broke. "I thought I was contributing to God's work," one whispered as she gently wiped her eyes. "My original recipient is now a mystery to me." Christian media outlets were not immune to the outcry for accountability and transparency that it sparked. For far too long, religious networks have presided over a climate of complete confidence, rarely having their practices scrutinized by those within their own ranks. Listeners. However, this time, they desired evidence. They desired to view invoices. They desired to know that the funds they contributed in trust weren't being used for private opulence. The story transpired to go beyond anyone's expectations. What had been a deft legal maneuver before became a warning sign as watchdog groups brought it to light, revealing how Daystar had avoided public financial reporting by claiming to be a church. Commentators started raising wider concerns, not only about Joni, but about the entire system that gave Daystar permission for this to happen. Joni continued to appear on camera, lead prayers, and speak about forgiveness and resilience. But even on video, something seemed odd. Her warmth appeared artificial. There was no longer the luster that had drawn audiences in. Viewers could perceive the pressure that lay beneath the surface. The scandal had more to do with trust, the irreplaceable kind, than with checks, trips, or breached rules, news releases, or remarks. The $100,000 could have been returned. But what really mattered was what was lost. The faith-inspiring notion that Daystar was a ministry that stood above reproach, a sanctuary for believers. Once trust is shattered, no amount of music or sermons can mend it. The lights were still on. The cameras were still rolling, and Joni was still smiling from behind the glossy white desk. But by the time the controversy reached its pinnacle, something inside the Daystar world had already altered forever. There was no longer any vitality. What had been a nourishing, vibrant presence now seemed lifeless. Her expression betrayed a burden she was unwilling to bear. While behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The once close-knit staff was now barely communicating. Meetings were dead silent, and the hallways that had been filled with music and laughing were now empty. Some employees averted their gaze, too timid to speak about topics that were previously known to everyone. It all started in a tiny boardroom when someone asked, "Did you use $100,000 of ministry money for your honeymoon?" Now the question had spread like wildfire, and donations were dropping fast, even from long-time faithful tithes. It wasn't wrath that caused the decline. It was sadness. People felt betrayed. Churches that had previously advertised Daystar discreetly took the network from their bulletins. The phone lines that had formerly been overwhelmed with prayer requests now rang less and less. They sought answers, not vengeance, and they never received them. Joni avoided discussing the subject on broadcast for months, instead focusing on faith, endurance, and overcoming adversity. Scandal and her deafening quiet became a confession in and of itself. Viewers recoiled at her calls for honesty and integrity, and social media was rife with comments demanding that she put her words into practice. Not even her staunchest supporters could defend her. Internet users who were first captivated by the narrative started to lose interest as time went on. They believed her when she claimed it was only a misunderstanding and that she had repaid the money, but their faith dwindled due to the lack of genuine transparency. People started to realize Daystar didn't provide explanations because he didn't have any good ones. The strain was too much for the ministry. Some long-term employees quietly left, not wanting to be associated with something that now felt corrupt. Others stayed, believing things would get better. Joni's attempts to pretend everything was normal backfired, isolating her from the people who had once had the greatest faith in her, Jimmy Evans, whose scandalous behavior had already rocked the ministry, and months later, he preached again, this time without mentioning names, but without denying that sin is sin when one remains silent. His words resounded far beyond his church, and many interpreted them as a subtle allusion to Daystar, a warning that denying reality is sin in and of itself. By that point, the damage had spread far and wide. Not only had donations collapsed, but credibility had also taken a nosedive. Audience size had shrunk. Ratings that had once reached millions were falling precipitously week after week. Advertisers were wary, and partners were cutting ties. Ministries withdrew their support. The financial impact was substantial, but the emotional toll was much higher. After Daystar's demise, many of his former supporters formed online groups, not to squabble, but to grieve, sharing stories of how Joni's words had comforted them in times of loss or anguish. How the broadcast had formerly been an integral part of their religious regimen. Now they felt forsaken, like children left alone in the dark. "It's not just about $100,000, one woman written. It's about the time I put my faith in something that turned out to be deceitful." "I've stopped even tuning in to Christian television altogether," another stated. "All of them have lost my trust." The loss of faith had far-reaching consequences, impacting more than simply Daystar. There were ripples in other ministries as well. People began to wonder where their money had gone. Investigative organizations started looking into other networks that had the same church classification gap. The scandal had exposed other families, revealed a structure that enabled spiritual leaders to function independently of scrutiny, leading to an increase in the volume of demands for accountability. Christian blogs and journalists pressured Daystar and all other faith-based organizations to be transparent, as they too had been operating in secrecy. "You owe people honesty if you're asking for money," according to one critic. God does not approve of dishonesty. Joni remained relatively silent throughout, while the incident was re-emphasized by secular media as a contemporary illustration of the unbridled power of religious empires. Everything from sharing inspirational quotes about overcoming adversity or having faith in God's timing to posting infrequently about the issue itself. Her social media posts were always carefully selected and edited. However, since genuineness cannot be faked, people could tell. A follower said, "You taught us to be accountable. Now show us how." The number of comments, angry messages, and heartbreak messages increased with each post. According to those in the know, morale was at an all-time low, and things were far worse behind closed doors. Daystar, which had been vibrant before, was now suffocating in its own quiet. Jonathan had also become silent. Some workers were embarrassed to reveal their workplace, while others remained simply for the paycheck. He had avoided interviews and talk shows because he didn't think they were necessary. His query had already exposed the truth, something no expose could have done. He had simply ventured to ask what no one else dared, and it was all because of him that the illusion crumbled. Slowly but surely, the network started cutting back. Less programming, less money, fewer employees. The empire was still standing, but its base was weak. The change was palpable, like a magnificent edifice that looked beautiful, but was actually crumbling. Out of the chaos, things started to happen in the larger Christian community. Churches started having internal evaluations. Some ministries began, however, the building itself was infested with termites, so a good shake might have brought it all crashing down. Companies were beginning to wake up, with some willingly publishing their financial records and others inviting outside auditors for the first time. People were realizing that they didn't want to destroy faith, but rather protect it. I wanted to make sure that what occurred at Daystar would never happen again. The irony was that Joni could have saved herself and the ministry with just one step of humility, with an honest confession. If she had sat down on camera, stared directly into the lens and stated, "I made a mistake," those around her might have been willing to forgive me if I hadn't spent money I shouldn't have. Honor should have replaced repentance, and the same viewers who gave so generously would have given grace equally. Ultimately, the controversy wasn't only about missing out on funds. It was about something far more substantial, the gradual decline that occurs when reputation takes precedence over reality. Daystar didn't collapse due to a single poor choice. It collapsed because, for an excessive amount of time, nobody dared to stand up. Years later, people still bring it up, not in a furious way, but with a heavy heart. They recall how Daystar was once a beacon of hope. Joni's words used to soothe, but now the trust has faded and the innocence that made Daystar. The music and the sermons all continue to play an important role, but they lack the genuine emotion that formerly brought them to life. The genuineness of the once pure trust has vanished, replaced with a lesson etched in the stillness of decay. When the truth is concealed, faith withers away. At this point, Joni's silence is broken only by the reverberation of the initial query, which lingers in the atmosphere like a specter.